Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. This will be the continuation of Hidden Messages. This will be part 21, chapter 21, entitled A Heavy Day. Izuku met with Aizawa and Shinsou the next morning, expecting a day like the previous, but that wasn't the case. Aizawa took them to the train station just like at the beginning of their work studies, except this time they actually got on a train. Izuku and Shinsou both questioned where they were going, but Aizawa didn't answer, even as they had stood in front of Endeavor's agency. Confused, the two students followed Aizawa into the building, not unlike baby ducklings following their mom. They had no idea where they were going, nor did they know why they were there, but they didn't argue. Apparently, the agency was expecting them, though, because they were immediately led up to a conference room with no questions. After a few minutes, they were joined by Endeavor, Todoroki, and Katsuki. Izuku wanted to go over to Katsuki, but he still didn't know why they were there, so he held back. I still don't understand why you need my work-study students to test this, but be quick about it. We're leaving on patrol in an hour. Endeavor addressed Aizawa before returning to his work-study students. You two stay here with Eraserhead. Be ready to go in an hour. As soon as he finished speaking, Endeavor had stormed out of the room. All four boys looked at Aizawa, waiting to hear why they were there. After what happened last night, I have done a lot of thinking about how that was possible. I have a few theories, but we're here to test the most plausible one. Shinsou and Izuku no longer looked confused, but Katsuki and Todoroki somehow looked even more so. Izuku was going to text Katsuki to tell him about the previous night, but he hadn't had a chance to yet, and neither Shinsou nor Izuku had mentioned anything in the group chat or to Todoroki for him to have any idea what was going on. Aizawa pulled out a piece of paper with a bunch of writing on it and handed it to Izuku, and then pulled out blank pieces of paper and writing utensils, and he passed them out to the other three. Midoriya, I want you to use your secret language to tell Bakugo the first line on the paper. Bakugo, I want you to write down exactly what he tells you. Izuku did what he was told, reading the first line on the paper, and after a moment, Aizawa looked over the paper that Bakugo had, verifying that he'd written down the same thing. Good. Now, Midoriya, tell Shinsou the next line using that same secret language. Aizawa continued. Huh? Katsuki's eyes were wide as he looked between Izuku and Shinsou. Izuku ignored Katsuki for a moment and did what he was told. Aizawa checked the paper that Shinsou was writing on a moment later. He showed Izuku that Shinsou had written parts of what Izuku had said. It wasn't exactly word for word, like a transcript like Katsuki had done, but it was just the important words, just enough to get the idea of what line he had said. Katsuki looked on with wide eyes, and Izuku was instructed to do the same with Todoroki. The results were similar, but it seemed like he understood a bit less than Shinsou did. Okay, now, Midoriya, tell Bakugo the next line of your paper. Bakugo, write it down just like before. Right before Izuku tried to relay the next line, Aizawa activated his quirk while looking at him. This time, Katsuki was only able to write down general information, not unlike what Shinsou had written before. They went through the same test with Shinsou and then Todoroki, both times with Aizawa using his quirk on Izuku. Neither of them was able to write anything on the papers this time. The silence grew heavy as they realized what that meant. Surprisingly, it was Shinsou that broke the silence first. You have another quirk. He sounded annoyed, and Izuku couldn't blame him. He's collecting quirks like broken bones, and that was a problem in and of itself. When the fuck did you get this one? Katsuki asked, but Izuku knew that he was really asking something different. Izuku felt the disappointment, too. The realization that their secret language was really just a quirk. Katsuki wasn't really asking about when he got it. He was wondering if their secret language was really a language at all. I don't know. Izuku looked at Aizawa, hoping that his teacher would have some answers. I would guess that you've had this quirk the longest, probably for years, but you never knew because it's so subtle. Both Katsuki and Izuku did their best to hide their disappointment, but they were unsuccessful. Aizawa noticed. You two still have a secret language. Bakugo, you still mostly understood him when my quirk was active, but I think that Midoriya's quirk works by increasing understanding. Not by a lot, but just enough that someone who knows him well can understand what he's trying to get across. This is why Shinsou understands better than Todoroki. As they sat there, taking in what Aizawa had said, it hit Izuku that if he had a quirk for years, then he wasn't actually quirkless. He never had been. His whole world crashed around him. He understood what Katsuki felt back when he had first found out that Izuku had a quirk, how he thought that everything that they'd been through was unnecessary if someone just noticed. Their years-long ruse, the horrible things that Katsuki had said and done to Izuku, all the secrets, all the lying, it was all unnecessary. Izuku had never been quirkless. Katsuki was having a similar revelation across the room. Both of them were so caught up in their thoughts that they weren't paying any attention to the people around them. Both had tears streaming down their faces, but neither noticed. Todoroki looked completely confused by the whole situation. He understood why Izuku was reacting the way he was, but he didn't know enough of their backstory to understand why Katsuki was also upset by the revelation. Aizawa and Shinsou both knew and understood, but they also felt bad for the two. Shinsou didn't know the full backstory of Izuku's quirks, but he knew enough about what his quirklessness had caused their middle school days to be like, and Aizawa knew it all. Time passed, and Aizawa had to bring them both back to the present. Katsuki had to go on patrol soon. Aizawa was gracious enough to drag Todoroki and Shinsou out of the room to give the boys a moment to process together. Once they were alone, Izuku and Katsuki just looked at each other. A moment later, Katsuki ran across the room to hold Izuku in his arms. They cried as they hugged, not sure what else to do. After a moment, Katsuki pulled back slightly to press his lips to Izuku's cheek before pulling him back in. "This doesn't change anything, Deku, you got that?" Katsuki tried to sound fierce, but his voice came out wet. "We fought through hell to get here. You have a fucking quirk, and that doesn't change that. Even knowing what we know now, I would do it all again, as long as we end up here, with you in my arms." Izuku sobbed into Katsuki's chest, but he nodded. "I would too, Kachan. I would too." Katsuki ran his hand through Izuku's hair, pressing Izuku against his chest. "Well, then stop fucking crying, you damn nerd." Katsuki tried to put some humor in his voice, but it fell flat. Luckily, Izuku giggled anyway. "But I'm a Midoriya. Crying is what we do." Both boys laughed at that, before finally pulling away from each other. "I gotta go patrol now, but I expect you to tell me all about how you figured this shit out after, okay?" Katsuki ruffled Izuku's hair. "Of course, Kachan. I'll tell you all about it." Izuku smiled his brightest smile ever at his favorite person, making it so that Katsuki couldn't help but grin back. They both left the room with red-rimmed eyes, and the remnants of tears streaked down their faces, but also with large smiles and their hands intertwined. They separated as they joined the rest of the group, and Todoroki and Katsuki had left to go on patrol. Aizawa led his work-study students out of the building, acknowledging his gratitude at Endeavor for allowing them to intrude on their schedule as they ran into the man before they left. Izuku assumed that they were heading to the train station to go back to campus, but to his surprise, they turned in the opposite direction. Izuku was going to ask why, but he didn't bother, figuring that he would not get an answer anyway. They walked for a few blocks before stopping outside a cafe, and Izuku read the sign and gasped. "A cat cafe?" "I figured that you could use a bit of a break." Aizawa hid his face in his capture weapon, trying to sound gruff, but failing miserably. Izuku smiled and followed Shinsou inside. They went and got drinks before sitting down at a table. The cats crowded moments later, but not hesitating a second before curling up on Aizawa and Shinsou's laps. It was obvious immediately that they had been there before, multiple times. The cats were more hesitant around Izuku, unsure of the new person, but it didn't take them long to crowd around him as well. It was relaxing, sitting there, drinking a hot drink, surrounded by cats. It was exactly what he needed after finding out about his quirk that morning. He knew that he would have to talk to All Might about it, and he will have to spend some time later figuring out more about his quirk, but for now, he could pet the cats and forget about it. Izuku barely noticed time passing, enjoying his time with his cats, but all too soon, the time they paid for ended. They all groaned at the prospect of leaving the cats behind, but they had no choice. Aizawa led them out of the cafe and back to the train station, heading back toward UA. After they had left the conference room, Izuku hadn't talked much. Aizawa and Shinsou had talked a bit at the cafe, but Izuku was just focusing on the cats. He remained silent until Shinsou had started up a conversation with him on the train. "So, Midoriya, did you enjoy seeing Kachan again?" Shinsou nudged Izuku and winked at him, obviously teasing him. Normally Izuku would turn red and stutter out an answer, but the morning had been emotionally exhausting, so he was sarcastic and said, "Ah, yes, that was what I was thinking about when I realized that I've had a quirk for years. I definitely wasn't mourning the relationship that we could have had if only someone had noticed it, that I had actually had a quirk earlier." Shinsou's eyes disappeared into his hair, and so did Aizawa's, even though he was attempting to pretend that he wasn't listening. Shinsou's mouth fell open as he tried to come up with a response. Izuku sighed and leaned his head back into the chair. "Sorry, it's been a long morning, and I'm emotionally exhausted. It was nice seeing Kachan, though." Shinsou remained silent for a moment before he finally came up with a response. "Sorry, I didn't mean to upset you or anything." "It's okay, you didn't. I just get kind of sassy when I'm tired," Izuku shrugged. "No shit," Shinsou laughed. "Well, I'll let you rest then for the rest of the trip." Shinsou moved a bit away from Izuku to give him more space to rest. "No, it's okay. I won't be able to rest on the train anyways." Izuku had waved his hands to stop Shinsou from moving. "Besides, I've been meaning to ask, what's going on with you and Kaminari, huh? Top allies in the assignment and calling each other by your first names?" Izuku raised his eyebrows. Shinsou went pink. Izuku laughed a bit at his friend's pink face, but waited for an answer. Shinsou glanced over at Aizawa, who was sleeping. Both boys knew that he wasn't actually asleep. He rarely ever was around other people, but he liked to pretend to be so that people would let their guard down around him. Izuku felt a little bad about asking about Shinsou's obvious crush in front of his dad, but Shinsou started their conversation by teasing him about Katsuki. "We are, dating, I guess. I mean, he confessed after the assignment. He said something about how you inspired him to finally do something about his feelings. We're planning on going on a date this weekend." Shinsou's face darkened a few shades as he was talking, going from pink to bright red. Izuku was practically vibrating in his seat for his friend, but before he said anything else, Aizawa beat him to it. "Hitoshi, what was the one rule I gave you?" Shinsou froze before slowly turning and looking at his dad. "No loud blondes," Shinsou mumbled. "But at least I didn't go for the explosive loud blonde or the condescending one." Shinsou argued his case. Izuku almost laughed, before realizing who the explosive loud blonde he was referring to is. "Hey, leave Kachan out of this." Aizawa groaned, but as he ran his hand over his face, the hint of a small smile was still visible. "Invite him over for dinner sometime. I'm sure Hisashi would love that." It sounded like a genuine invitation to Izuku, but Shinsou's face went pale, and the small smile that Aizawa was hiding had turned into his logical ruse grin. Izuku was suddenly very grateful that he was not Shinsou. He felt bad for his friend, so he decided to change the subject a bit. "Kachan and I are supposed to be going on a date this weekend, too." Izuku grinned, looking forward to the weekend. "Do you have any idea what you're going to be doing?" Shinsou asked, quick to take the offered segue away from the conversation that they'd been having moments before. "No, I asked Kachan out, but he's refusing to let me plan it. He says that I can plan the next one." Izuku pouted jokingly. He was a little upset that he couldn't plan their first date, but he wasn't nearly as upset as he was pretending to be. He trusts Katsuki, and he knows that he'll have a great time, no matter what he decides. Shinsou laughed. "That sounds like Bakugo." They spent the rest of the trip talking about their weekend plans, thankfully without any more input from Aizawa. When they arrived back at UA, Izuku was expecting them to go over maps or run through training courses or something like they'd been doing the past few days, but Aizawa just sent them back to the dorms. He told them to rest until later tonight when they'd meet up to go on another patrol. Izuku was hesitant to waste an afternoon resting, but Aizawa was right in pointing out that he was exhausted. He hadn't done anything physically tiring all day, but he could really use a nap. By the time they met up that night, Izuku was feeling better. He hadn't really realized how dead he had felt after their morning trip until he didn't feel like that anymore. He had taken a nap and a shower, and he ate something, so he felt ready to go on a good patrol. They took down a similar path they had the night before, but they were all more cautious, not like it mattered anyway. The streets were quiet for a while, and then they weren't. First, they heard a loud, cackling laugh. It was eerie, echoing through the previously quiet streets. Next, they heard creaking and then screams. All three of them had ran straight into the bar on the bottom floor of a building next to them, the origin of the sound. They froze in their tracks as they took in the scene around them. A man stood in the center of the room, holding a button down on a small device in his hand. Civilians were in groups around the perimeter, ducking away from the men who held guns pointed at them. In total, there were 5 villains involved, 4 holding guns and controlling the civilians, and 1 holding a device that they could now see was a detonator. There were explosives strapped to the base of the pillar in the center of the room. That was concerning all on its own, but the state of the room made it even worse. There were bullet holes and damage on all the walls around them. The building was already creaking. From the number of explosives at the base of the pillar, it was obvious that their objective wasn't to explode everyone in the room, but to take down the pillar that was currently only supported by the upper floors and the walls as damaged as they were. They planned to crush everyone there. Eraserhead and his students stopped at the entrance, unsure of what the best move was. There were no indications of what the villains' motives were or what their quirks are, but they had about 20 hostages. Fortunately, the villain that was holding the detonator noticed them before they could come up with a plan. "Good. Our last guests have arrived. Heroes, why don't you come in and join us?" The villain grinned, and Izuku grimaced as he realized that they had walked right into another trap. This time it looked like they weren't trying to catch anyone in particular. They didn't seem to recognize which heroes there were, or even that 2 of them were just students. They just saw their costumes and figured that they would work for whatever their plan was. "Now, I only think it's fair that you know why you're dying." The villain holding the detonator spoke, looking around at the civilians and heroes that were trapped there. "See, the company that made this building made another of the same exact design. There was a bar on the bottom floor just like this one, and the apartments above. My sister lived in one of those apartments with her husband and son. They thought it was safe. The company that owned them had told him it was. but they lied. The villain's eyes became feral the more they talked. "You see this pillar?" The villain waved his arm in the direction of the pillar that was set to explode. "It's the only thing that keeps up all the upper floors from crashing down. Isn't the best idea, but it's completely legal as long as all the correct rules are followed and the correct materials are used." The villain was starting to shake with anger. This company thought that it was too expensive, though. They built the pillar using cheaper, weaker materials. A fight broke out in the bar beneath my sister's apartment. A man with a strength enhancer threw someone through that pillar. Whole thing collapsed months after it was opened. My sister and her family died because the company couldn't pay a little bit more to make sure that their building was safe. Of course, nothing was done about it, though. It was newly opened, so there weren't a lot of people inside when it collapsed, and it wasn't in the best part of town, so no one cared. The villain cackled maniacally. "I'll make them listen this time, though. This building's full. Not a single apartment is up for rent. And now our final guests have arrived. The world will have to care once I kill so many civilians and 3 heroes. The first thing a hero is trained to do in a situation like this is to talk the villain down, but they never got the chance. The second the villain finished his monologue, he released the trigger, setting the timer off to blow up the pillar. From where they were huddled, Izuku could see a small screen saying 10 seconds. That wasn't enough time to get everyone out, but it might be enough time to do something. "Get the villains and then evacuate the civilians. I'll make sure that the ceiling doesn't crush everyone." Izuku used his and Katsuki's secret language again. He needed to figure out another easier-to-understand language to use, but this would work for now. Aizawa and Shinsou had both jumped into action, both shooting him a quick look of concern before they started going after the villains. After the timer had been activated, the villains started moving toward the door, keeping the guns pointed at the civilians to make sure that none of them escaped. When Aizawa and Shinsou had started going after them, only one was able to see them, so they weren't in too much danger of being shot. Izuku trusted that they would get the villains, so he moved into action, doing his job. He punched out the windows at the front of the bar to create another exit, one not blocked by villains, and started waving the civilians to go through. As the timer went down to 1 second, he floated himself to the ceiling, bracing himself against the support beam that ran through the center, the one that the pillar was holding up. And he took a deep breath, activated the highest percentage of 1 for all that he could handle. The pillar exploded and fell apart, but the ceiling did not crash into the ground. Izuku slowly sunk to the ground, holding the building up. His bones creaked as the entire weight of the building had settled on him, but he stood strong. A few civilians had gaped at him before they left, obviously in shock that someone so small was holding up a whole building. Izuku was trying to hold the ceiling as high as he could, but even then, it was just at his head height, meaning that everyone was having to duck to get out. As the weight had bore down on him, he went through breathing exercises that Aizawa had taught him, trying to stay calm, even in the face of getting crushed. He hoped that Aizawa and Shinsou had been successful, and had moved on to evacuate the rest of the building, but no one was left in the bar to give him any idea of what was happening elsewhere. Every moment, the strain of his muscles got worse. He knew that he wouldn't be able to last too much longer. With no one near him, and no clocks visible to him, he had no way of knowing how long he'd been there. Faintly, he could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. Izuku's whole body was shaking when Aizawa reappeared in front of him. The relief he felt at hearing the gruff voice of his teacher was indescribable, even as the words he heard were all curses. "Shit, Deku. More heroes are on the way. We're trying to clear out the building, but it's going to take a while. How much longer can you last?" Aizawa looked Izuku over for any injuries. "Not long," Izuku grunted out through clenched teeth. "Villains?" "We caught them all. They're in custody." Aizawa checked the area around them, making sure that there was no one else hidden or trapped there. Izuku could faintly hear yelling and explosions in the distance, and then someone came bursting through the door. Cold crept into the room behind Izuku, and even though he couldn't see where it was coming from, it was familiar enough that he knew who had arrived. The temperature kept dropping as Izuku struggled to keep holding the weight up. He wouldn't last long, and everyone in the room knew it. Aizawa got closer to him, ready to catch him when he inevitably collapsed. "Deku, you can let go now. Shoto's built enough supports." He could barely hear Aizawa over the rush in his ears, but he listened. Carefully he dropped his arms down, resting the weight on the ice support the Todoroki has made. As soon as it was apparent that they would hold, Izuku fully let himself succumb to the darkness that had been crowding the edges of his vision for a while. He faintly registered gentle arms holding him as his vision went dark. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 21 of Hidden Messages. Chapter 22 will be next. That'll be the last and final chapter of this fic. Hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.